In August 1996, the Carter family lived on a working corn farm in Washington County, Iowa, a place where family histories were measured in harvests, property lines, school years, and the quiet trust that held small rural communities together. Gregory Carter had taken over the land from his father and built his adult life around keeping the farm productive. His wife, Natalie Carter, had once taught elementary school before leaving the classroom to care for their home and their only child, 5-year-old Madeline Carter. Their life was modest, structured, and deeply familiar to the people around them. Madeline was not the kind of child who wandered far. She preferred routines, familiar rooms, and the small boundaries she understood. She rarely went beyond the yard without an adult. She carried a gray stuffed rabbit almost everywhere, a worn toy with one ear repaired by Natalie using thick black thread after the family dog had damaged it months earlier. The stitching was uneven, but Madeline had loved the rabbit even more after the repair. She also wore a small silver identification bracelet that had been given to her by her grandmother. The inside was engraved with her name, Madeline. Near the first letter was a tiny triangular scratch from an earlier accident on the stone step outside the house. Natalie remembered the mark clearly because she had once considered having the bracelet polished and repaired. Madeline had wanted it left exactly as it was. On August 12, 1996, nothing about the day suggested that the Carter family was approaching the event that would divide their lives into a before and an after. Around midday, Madeline was playing with bubble solution near the front porch. The family's aging golden retriever remained nearby, as calm as he had been on countless other afternoons. Natalie was preparing lunch inside the house and expected Madeline to remain within the front yard, where she had been told to stay. At approximately 12:15 p.m., Natalie last knew exactly where her daughter was. Only a short time later, the yard was empty. The bubble wand remained near the porch. The plastic bottle of soap was still on the grass. The dog showed no sign that anything unusual had happened. There had been no warning, no obvious disturbance, and no indication that Madeline had decided to leave the property on her own. At first, the situation did not seem possible. Madeline had always respected the limits around the house. The surrounding farm was open enough that a child should have been visible if she had simply moved toward the driveway, the outbuildings, or the edge of the fields. Natalie checked the places a 5-year-old might choose without thinking. The areas beside the house, the garden, the interior rooms, storage spaces, and the places where a child might hide during a game. There was no sign of her. Gregory was contacted and returned from work on another part of the property. Together, he and Natalie searched the farm more thoroughly. They checked the machine sheds, the margins of the fields, drainage areas, nearby water, and the road. The longer the search continued, the harder it became to maintain the belief that Madeline had simply wandered somewhere nearby. The county sheriff's office was finally called. Sheriff Frank Holloway knew the Carter family and understood what a missing 5-year-old meant in a rural county. The first priority was still to treat the disappearance as a possible wandering incident. Children could become lost, injured, trapped, or drawn toward water without anyone noticing. Search teams were organized quickly. Deputies began working outward from the house while neighbors arrived to help. By the afternoon, the Carter farm had become the center of a large community search. Volunteers checked cornfields, ditches, barns, culverts, tree lines, and neighboring properties. Farmers who knew the land helped identify wells, drainage routes, equipment areas, and places that would not be obvious to outsiders. The search expanded across roads and adjoining acreage, but nothing connected clearly to Madeline. No shoe was found. No piece of clothing appeared. No blood, broken object, or obvious sign of an accident turned up. The lack of evidence became more alarming when a trained tracking dog was brought to the property. Using an item carrying Madeline's scent, the dog established a trail beginning near the house. The scent moved across the front yard toward the county road. For the investigators, this was the first solid indication that Madeline had not remained somewhere hidden on the property. The dog reached the edge of the road. Then the trail stopped. It did not continue along the shoulder. It did not cross into a neighboring ditch. It did not move toward another field. The scent appeared to end at the point where the Carter property met the road. That finding changed the meaning of the entire search. If Madeline had wandered away, the trail should have continued somewhere. If she had moved down the road on foot, the dog should have followed. If she had been dragged during a violent struggle, investigators expected some physical disruption, noise, or reaction from the family dog. None of those signs existed. The golden retriever had remained unusually calm. That detail began to matter more than anyone had expected. The dog was old, but he was familiar with the rhythms of the property. He knew neighbors, delivery drivers, relatives, and farm workers. A stranger approaching the yard or forcing Madeline into a vehicle should have produced some reaction. Yet no one recalled barking, agitation, or anything that suggested the presence of an unknown threat. By nightfall, Sheriff Holloway was no longer thinking only about a lost child. The investigation was beginning to point toward a far more disturbing possibility. Madeline Carter may have walked willingly from her yard to the edge of the road. And if she had entered a vehicle there without screaming, resisting, or alarming the family dog, then whoever had taken her was probably not a stranger. It was someone she trusted. The first major break in the investigation came the morning after Madeline Carter disappeared, when a retired rural mail carrier named Earl Jensen gave Sheriff Frank Holloway a statement that changed the direction of the case. Earl had worked postal routes across Washington County for nearly 30 years. In a farming community where the same families lived on the same land for generations, he knew the roads, the properties, and the vehicles associated with most households. He knew which trucks belonged to local farmers, which dogs reacted to his mail vehicle, and which families usually had children near the road during the summer. On August 12th, shortly before Madeline vanished, Earl had driven past the Carter property. Near the family mailbox, he noticed a brown pickup truck stopped along the roadside. At the time, nothing about it seemed alarming. Rural neighbors often stopped to speak to one another from their vehicles, and children sometimes approached a familiar adult without hesitation. What Earl remembered clearly was Madeline. She was near the truck with her gray stuffed rabbit. She did not appear frightened or distressed. She was engaged with the person inside the vehicle as though the encounter was ordinary. The Carter family's aging golden retriever was nearby and showed no sign of alarm. That detail immediately reinforced the theory Sheriff Holloway had begun considering the previous night. Whoever had stopped near the Carter property was probably someone Madeline already knew. The investigation shifted away from the possibility of an unknown traveler passing through the county and toward the people connected to the Carter family. Deputies began reviewing relatives, farm workers, delivery drivers, neighbors, church acquaintances, and anyone who had regular access to the property. A second witness made the situation much more serious. Dorothy Lane, a 71-year-old widow who lived near a rural intersection approximately 2 miles from the Carter farm, had been home that afternoon and remembered a brown pickup traveling away from the direction of the Carter property. The truck moved slowly enough to catch her attention. She could not identify the driver or read a license plate, but she remembered several distinctive features. The truck had a noticeable dent on the rear quarter panel and a tailgate faded from years of exposure. More importantly, Dorothy recalled seeing the outline of a small child in the passenger area. Deputies immediately recognized the description. The vehicle belonged to Harold Bennett. Harold was 58 years old and lived alone on a modest farm a short distance from the Carters. He had known Gregory Carter for years and was familiar enough with the family that his presence near the property would not have seemed unusual. He was also one of the many local residents who had joined the search for Madeline. That fact made the identification especially disturbing. Harold had participated openly in the community effort. He had helped check areas near the creek, provided equipment, and remained involved while volunteers searched through the night. Nothing about his public behavior suggested that he was trying to avoid the investigation. Sheriff Holloway and his deputies approached him carefully. Harold explained that around noon on August 12th he had driven into town to purchase a replacement part for his tractor. He provided a receipt from a local hardware store showing that he had made a purchase after Madeline disappeared. The receipt gave Harold something close to an alibi. The timing did not completely eliminate him, but it made the case difficult. The distance between the Carter farm and the store left only a narrow period in which Harold could have passed the property, taken Madeline, and continued into town. There was no direct evidence showing that Madeline had ever entered his truck. Harold also agreed to allow investigators to search his property. Deputies examined his farmhouse, outbuildings, equipment areas, and surrounding land. Search dogs were brought in. Investigators looked for clothing, hair, blood, personal items, or any indication that a 5-year-old child had recently been there. Nothing was found. There was no trace of Madeline Carter on Harold Bennett's property. For many investigators, that should have weakened the theory significantly. Harold had no known violent criminal history, he had cooperated with law enforcement, and the physical search produced nothing. But a younger investigator named Aaron Price remained uneasy. Price had reviewed the witness statements several times. Earl Jensen's account placed Madeline beside a vehicle she approached without fear. Dorothy Lane's statement placed a truck matching Harold's description leaving the area with a small child inside. The family dog had not reacted. Harold knew the Carters and would have been familiar to Madeline. The pattern was difficult to dismiss. What Price could not understand was motive. Harold Bennett was not known as an aggressive man. He had no public conflict with Madeline. There had never been any allegation that he had behaved inappropriately around children. If he had taken her, Price needed to understand why. He began examining older records associated with the Bennett and Carter families. The answer was buried in county property files. Years before Madeline was born, the two families had been involved in a bitter dispute over approximately 40 acres of farmland near a creek that bordered their properties. The Bennett family claimed the land belonged to them based on an old informal agreement between previous generations. When Gregory Carter inherited the family farm, he relied on official county surveys and legally recognized boundaries. Those records placed the disputed acreage within the Carter property. The Bennett family challenged the claim. The dispute eventually became a civil case and consumed a substantial amount of money in legal expenses. Harold's father fought the decision for years, convinced that land his family considered theirs was being taken through paperwork rather than history. The court ultimately ruled in favor of the Carter family. The result damaged the Bennett farm financially. Harold's father had spent much of his remaining savings on the legal battle and died not long after the case ended. Harold inherited a smaller, heavily burdened operation and the consequences of a conflict he believed had destroyed his father's final years. There had been no public retaliation. Harold never threatened Gregory. He never created a scene in town. He continued living nearby and maintained the kind of outwardly civil relationship common in rural communities where people might remain neighbors even after deep disagreements. But Price now saw the history differently. The absence of open anger did not mean the resentment had disappeared. For years, Harold had watched Gregory Carter continue building a successful farm on land the Bennett family believed should have belonged to them. If Harold blamed Gregory not only for the loss of acreage but also for the financial collapse and death of his father, then the disappearance of Gregory's only child carried a possible motive that investigators had never considered. It was not a motive based on money. It was not an impulsive dispute. It was the possibility of revenge that had remained silent for years. By the time Price placed the old property records beside the witness statements, Harold Bennett was no longer simply a helpful neighbor whose truck happened to resemble one seen on the road. He had become the first person in the investigation with both opportunity and a reason to want the Carter family to experience a loss that could never be repaired. By the time Aaron Price finished reviewing the old property dispute, the investigation had finally developed something it had lacked since Madeline Carter disappeared. A possible motive that connected Harold Bennett directly to the Carter family. The theory was still circumstantial. No physical evidence placed Madeline inside Harold's truck or on his property. The hardware store receipt still complicated the timeline. But Price believed the combination of witness statements, Harold's familiarity with Madeline, the family dog's lack of reaction, and the history between the two families was too significant to ignore. Sheriff Frank Holloway agreed that Harold needed to be questioned again. The second interview was never conducted. When deputies returned to Harold Bennett's farm, they found that he had already left Washington County. At first, his departure appeared to have a simple explanation. Harold had struggled financially for years. The old civil dispute had reduced the Bennett family's holdings, and the remaining farm had become increasingly difficult to operate profitably. Neighbors knew that Harold had discussed selling at some point. There was nothing illegal about a man in his late 50s deciding to leave a failing farm and start over somewhere else. The timing, however, immediately raised concern. Investigators began reviewing land records and financial activity connected to the Bennett property. They discovered that Harold had already been considering a sale before Madeline vanished. He had made preliminary contact with an agricultural broker because of debt, declining income, and the difficulty of maintaining the property alone. That fact mattered. It meant Harold had not necessarily planned an abduction months in advance. He had already been thinking about leaving Iowa for financial reasons. After Madeline disappeared, however, the sale process accelerated with unusual speed. The farm was transferred at a price below what investigators believed Harold might have received under normal circumstances. The terms favored a quick closing rather than a prolonged negotiation. Shortly afterward, much of the money was moved out of accounts that local investigators could easily follow under the financial systems available in 1996. Harold left no forwarding address. There was no confirmed destination. His known telephone service was disconnected. The brown pickup truck was gone. For Price, the departure strengthened the suspicion that Harold had used a financial plan that already existed as a way to remove himself from Iowa before investigators could build a stronger case. But suspicion was not enough to establish that Madeline had left with him. The sheriff's department faced a serious legal problem. They had two witnesses whose statements pointed toward Harold's truck, but neither had seen the driver clearly. Dorothy Lane had only observed the silhouette of a small child. Earl Jensen had seen Madeline near a vehicle, but he had not positively identified Harold behind the wheel. The search of Harold's property had produced nothing. There was no trace of Madeline's clothing. There was no blood evidence. There was no hair sample that could be tied to her. There was no photograph, note, recording, or personal possession connecting the missing child to Harold Bennett. Without stronger evidence, investigators could not transform their theory into a nationwide criminal case. Harold became the central unresolved figure in Madeline Carter's disappearance, but he did not become a formally proven abductor. Weeks passed. Then months. The large volunteer searches ended. Tips continued to come into the sheriff's office, but most led nowhere. Sightings were reported from truck stops, shopping centers, state fairs, and highways across the Midwest. Each possibility was checked as far as resources allowed. None resulted in Madeline being found. The Carter family remained in Washington County. Gregory continued operating the farm because abandoning it would not bring his daughter back. Natalie lived with a different kind of routine. Every passing year created a new age for a child who existed only in memory. Madeline should have started elementary school, then middle school, then high school. She should have learned to drive. She should have graduated. She should have become an adult. But in the Carter household, the last confirmed version of Madeline remained 5 years old. Natalie preserved what she could. Photographs stayed organized. Kindergarten worksheets were kept. Small childhood possessions were placed inside a wooden memory box. On Madeline's birthday each year, Natalie wrote a letter describing what had happened in the family during the previous 12 months. She never mailed those letters because there was nowhere to send them. They accumulated inside the box. One object was never placed there. The silver identification bracelet Madeline had been wearing on August 12, 1996, remained missing. Natalie had described it in detail during the original investigation. The bracelet had been a gift from Madeline's grandmother. The inside carried the engraved name Madeline. Beside the first letter was a small triangular scratch that Natalie remembered because she had once considered having the bracelet repaired. Investigators included the bracelet in the missing property records. It was never recovered during the search. Over time, the case changed status. Sheriff Holloway eventually retired. Aaron Price remained troubled by the Bennett theory for years, but he too eventually left law enforcement without learning where Harold had gone or what had happened to Madeline. The original reports were moved from active investigative files into long-term storage. The disappearance became one of those cases remembered by older residents and taught to younger deputies as an example of how quickly a child could vanish even in a close rural community. 25 years passed. By 2021, Gregory and Natalie Carter had spent half their adult lives without knowing whether their daughter had survived beyond the day she disappeared. Madeline would have been 30 years old. Around the time of her 30th birthday, a small package arrived at the Carter family mailbox. There was no personal letter inside. There was no explanation. There was no name identifying the sender. The package contained a child's silver bracelet, darkened with age. The engraving on the inside was still readable. Madeline. Beside the first letter was a small triangular scratch. For 25 years, Natalie Carter had known that mark existed on only one bracelet. The object that had disappeared with her 5-year-old daughter in 1996 had just returned home. The package containing Madeline Carter's bracelet reached the Washington County Sheriff's Office as evidence in 2021, 25 years after the original disappearance. By then, nearly everyone who had worked the case in 1996 was retired, and the investigation belonged to a generation of officers who knew Madeline's name from archived reports rather than personal memory. The case was assigned to Detective Mason Reed. Reed had been a child when Madeline disappeared. He had never met Sheriff Frank Holloway or worked beside Aaron Price, but he understood immediately why the bracelet mattered. The original case file contained Natalie Carter's detailed description from August 1996. A child-sized silver identification bracelet, the name Madeline engraved on the inside, and a small triangular scratch beside the first letter. The object in the package matched that description. The bracelet was sent for forensic examination. Its age, wear pattern, engraving, and physical characteristics were consistent with the photographs and evidence records preserved from 1996. Investigators could not establish an uninterrupted chain of custody across 25 years, but there was no reasonable indication that the bracelet was a modern reproduction. Natalie had also identified the distinctive scratch immediately, a detail that had never been emphasized publicly during the original search. The package itself offered less. There was no useful fingerprint evidence connecting it to a sender. Nothing inside identified who had mailed it or why it had been returned after so many years. But the postal processing information provided something investigators in 1996 had never possessed. The package had originated in Bonner County, Idaho. That single geographical connection was enough for Reed to reopen the Harold Bennett theory. The old reports showed that Harold had disappeared from Washington County shortly after Madeline vanished. Investigators at the time had known that he had accelerated the sale of his struggling farm and left Iowa without providing a forwarding address. What they had never discovered was where he eventually settled. In 1996, a person moving across state lines could leave behind a much thinner administrative trail than in 2021. Reed now had access to digitized property records, interstate databases, tax information, archived residential histories, and public records that had once required separate requests to individual counties. He searched for Harold Bennett in and around Bonner County. The results produced a connection almost immediately. A man with Harold Bennett's full name and matching age had owned rural property outside Sandpoint, Idaho, for many years. The purchase history placed him in northern Idaho after his departure from Iowa. The records did not prove that he had brought Madeline with him, but they established something Aaron Price had never been able to confirm. Harold Bennett had not simply vanished. He had rebuilt his life hundreds of miles away. Reed continued through Associated Records and found another name connected to the same address. Grace Bennett. The basic information appeared ordinary until Reed compared her age with the missing person file. Grace was 30 years old. Madeline Carter would also have been 30 in 2021. Reed then began reconstructing Grace Bennett's documented life from the earliest record he could find. Her birth certificate immediately created another problem. It had not been issued at the time of her stated birth. Instead, it was a delayed registration completed near the end of 1996, only a few months after Madeline disappeared in Iowa. According to the certificate, Grace had been born at home and later placed in the care of her maternal grandfather, Harold Bennett. The supporting documentation was unusually thin. Nothing in the record automatically proved fraud. Delayed birth registrations still occurred, particularly in rural areas, and administrative standards in the mid-1990s were not identical to those used 25 years later. But when Reed placed the document beside the timeline of Madeline's disappearance, the timing became difficult to ignore. A 5-year-old girl vanished from Iowa in August 1996. Within months, Harold Bennett established a new life in another state. And a young girl of the same age appeared in his household under a newly documented identity. Reed next contacted the school district associated with Harold's Idaho address. Grace's early educational records were limited. There were no complete kindergarten files, no clear transfer documentation from another public school, and no previous academic history that established where she had lived before Idaho. Harold had reported that Grace had been educated at home before entering the local school system. At the time, the explanation had apparently caused little concern. The district had no reason to compare a new student with missing child bulletins from Iowa. Harold presented himself as a grandfather raising a child after family loss, and Grace appeared to have entered school without any obvious disciplinary, medical, or legal issue that would have forced officials to investigate further. For 25 years, that explanation remained unchallenged. Reed began locating former teachers and classmates. Most remembered Grace as intelligent, quiet, and closely attached to Harold. Nothing in those memories suggested that anyone had suspected she had been abducted. She had grown up under a stable name, attended school, and become part of the local community. One former classmate, however, remembered something unusual. When Grace was still young, she had once become confused during a classroom birthday discussion and wondered whether a person could have more than one birthday. At the time, the question had seemed like the kind of strange idea children sometimes expressed. No adult treated it as significant. For Reed, it carried a different meaning. If Grace had originally been Madeline, she would have entered her new life old enough to retain fragments of a previous identity. A different birthday, another name, or incomplete memories of another home could have survived without forming a complete narrative. A child exposed to a new story repeatedly might eventually accept the new version while still carrying isolated details that did not fit. The old classmate's memory did not prove anything, but it fit everything else. Reed now had the bracelet mailed from Idaho, Harold Bennett's confirmed property history, a woman whose age matched Madeline's exactly, a delayed birth registration created shortly after the disappearance, and an incomplete early school record. The next step was visual comparison. Reed obtained Grace Bennett's current driver's license photograph through official channels. The image showed a 30-year-old American woman whose life, according to every document she possessed, had begun under the name Grace Bennett. The sheriff's office also had an age-progressed image of Madeline Carter prepared for the missing person investigation. The comparison was impossible to dismiss as merely superficial. The proportions of the face, the spacing of the eyes, the jaw structure, and several smaller inherited features closely matched what investigators expected Madeline Carter to look like at 30. Reed still did not have DNA. He still did not have a confession. He still could not prove that Harold Bennett had taken a 5-year-old girl from Iowa in 1996. But for the first time in 25 years, the investigation no longer centered on where Madeline Carter might have died. It centered on a far more extraordinary possibility. Madeline Carter might still be alive, and for almost her entire life, she may have believed her name was Grace Bennett. Detective Mason Reed coordinated with law enforcement in Bonner County before making contact with Grace Bennett. By that point, the evidence was strong enough to justify a careful interview, but not strong enough to justify treating Grace as anything other than an adult whose identity might have been built on a crime committed when she was a child. Reed understood that the case could collapse if investigators approached her as though the truth were already settled. Grace was 30 years old and had spent almost her entire life in northern Idaho. Her records showed a stable adult existence. She had attended local schools, worked, paid taxes, maintained a driver's license, and lived under the same name for decades. Nothing in her public history suggested that she had ever questioned the foundation of that identity. The story she knew about herself was simple. Her parents had died when she was very young. Harold Bennett, her maternal grandfather, had taken responsibility for raising her. Because of the instability surrounding her early childhood, he had educated her at home for a period before enrolling her in public school. He had remained her primary family connection throughout her life. To Grace, Harold was not the suspicious neighbor described in an Iowa missing child file. He was the man who had raised her. That difference shaped everything that followed. Reed introduced the investigation as an old missing person case from Washington County, Iowa. He did not begin by accusing Harold of kidnapping Madeline Carter. Instead, he focused on the inconsistencies that had brought investigators to Idaho. Grace's date of birth matched Madeline's age. Her birth certificate had been registered months after Madeline disappeared. Her early educational history contained no independent record of where she had lived before Harold brought her into the Idaho school system. Harold Bennett had previously lived near the Carter family in Iowa. He had left Washington County shortly after Madeline vanished. And the bracelet Madeline had been wearing on the day of her disappearance had recently been mailed from Bonner County. Each fact could perhaps be explained separately. Together, they created a pattern. Grace did not accept that pattern. The name Madeline Carter meant nothing to the life she believed she had lived. The Carter family was unknown to her. Iowa was not home. Her childhood memories were centered on Harold, on the identity of Grace Bennett, and on the history he had given her. Reed showed her the age-progressed image created from Madeline's missing person case and explained why investigators believed the resemblance mattered. Grace remained unconvinced. Physical resemblance could happen between unrelated people. Birth records from rural communities could be incomplete. Homeschooling could explain missing educational documents. Harold's previous residence in Iowa did not prove he had committed a crime there. The more Reed explained, the more obvious the psychological problem became. Investigators were not asking Grace to accept one new fact. They were asking her to consider that almost every foundational fact of her life might be false. Her name, her childhood history, the deaths of the parents she had been told about, her relationship to Harold, even the meaning of the word family. For Reed, the simplest scientific solution was DNA. A voluntary cheek swab could establish whether Grace was biologically related to Gregory and Natalie Carter. If the test showed no relationship, the strongest version of the theory would collapse quickly. If it matched, the 25-year-old mystery would be resolved. Grace refused. Her refusal did not come from concern about the testing procedure. It came from what the test represented. Accepting DNA testing would mean treating the possibility seriously. Grace was not ready to do that. There was another factor making the situation more difficult. Harold Bennett was dying. He had been diagnosed with terminal heart failure and was receiving palliative care locally. His condition had deteriorated to the point that Grace believed he had only a limited amount of time remaining. For her, Harold's final stage of life took priority over an investigation she still viewed as mistaken. She had spent decades understanding him as the person who protected her when she had no one else. Now law enforcement wanted her to consider that the same man might have stolen her from another family. Grace would not participate in anything that could turn his final weeks into a criminal confrontation. That decision left Reed with a legal problem as serious as the emotional one. Grace was not a minor. She was not under arrest. She had not been accused of a crime. She was a competent adult with the right to refuse a voluntary genetic test. Investigators could seek a court order, but the evidence they possessed remained largely circumstantial. The bracelet strongly connected the present investigation to the 1996 disappearance, yet no one could prove who had mailed it. The delayed birth certificate was suspicious, but not automatically fraudulent. The school records were incomplete, but incomplete records from the 1990s were not unusual enough by themselves to establish kidnapping. Even the physical resemblance between Grace and the projected adult image of Madeline was not legal proof. Reed returned to Iowa and began working with prosecutors. The goal was to build a probable cause argument strong enough to support further legal action. The original witness statements were reviewed again. Harold Bennett's property records were compared with the timing of his departure. Grace's delayed birth registration was examined in greater detail. Investigators tried to identify anyone involved in the creation of her early documents who might still be alive. The process moved carefully because a mistake now could permanently damage the case. For 25 years, the Carter family had lived without an answer. Reed did not want to tell Gregory and Natalie that Grace Bennett was their daughter until the evidence could establish it beyond speculation. At the same time, he could not ignore the possibility that Madeline was finally within reach. 3 weeks passed. Then Bonner County contacted Reed with news that changed the investigation again. Harold Bennett had died. His death closed the most direct path to the truth. Whatever Harold knew about August 12, 1996, could no longer be obtained through interrogation. There would be no late confession in an interview room, no opportunity to confront him with the witnesses from Iowa, and no chance to ask how a 5-year-old girl had become Grace Bennett. For a brief period, Reed faced the possibility that the case had reached another dead end. Grace still had not agreed to DNA testing. Harold was gone. The evidence remained incomplete, and the only person who had lived through every stage of the mystery was still defending the identity he had given her. After Harold's death, Grace became responsible for handling the practical consequences of his estate. The home where she had been raised contained decades of paperwork, personal belongings, financial records, and family possessions that now had to be organized. For most of her life, she had believed she understood exactly who Harold Bennett had been. She was about to discover that one part of his life had been kept separate from everything he had allowed her to know. After Harold Bennett's death, Grace began the slow process of organizing the estate of the man she had believed was her grandfather. For most of her life, Harold had kept careful records. Bills, insurance documents, property papers, tax receipts, warranties, and personal files were stored with the same practical discipline that had shaped the household around her. Grace expected the work to be emotionally difficult but straightforward. Instead, it opened the first undeniable fracture in everything she believed about her childhood. Among the storage areas in the house was an attic space that had rarely been used for anything beyond seasonal belongings and old equipment. While sorting through documents connected to Harold's medical care and estate, Grace discovered that one section of the flooring concealed a narrow compartment beneath it. The space had been deliberately covered and was not identified in any inventory or household record. Inside was a locked cedar chest. Grace had never seen it before. That fact alone was unsettling. Harold had raised her in the same house for most of her life. She believed she knew the history of the property, the family possessions, and the things he considered important enough to preserve. A locked chest hidden beneath the floor did not fit the version of Harold Bennett she understood. When the chest was opened, the first items inside appeared to have nothing to do with the Bennett family. There were old newspaper clippings from Iowa. The name repeated through them was Madeline Carter. Grace had heard that name only recently, when Detective Mason Reed came to Idaho and suggested that she might be the 5-year-old girl who vanished from Washington County in 1996. At the time, she had rejected the possibility. The story seemed built from coincidences. A suspicious birth certificate, missing school records, physical resemblance, and Harold's past connection to the Carter family. The contents of the chest removed the possibility that Harold had known nothing about the case. He had preserved years of reporting about Madeline's disappearance. Some clippings documented the original search. Others followed the Carter family in later years. There were updates published on anniversaries, community efforts to keep the case visible, and occasional stories about Natalie and Gregory Carter continuing to remember a daughter who had never been found. The collection was deliberate. It had been maintained across decades. Beneath the articles were photographs of the Carter family taken from a distance. They were not family photographs copied from newspapers. They appeared to have been taken privately over different periods of time. Gregory appeared older in each group. Natalie did too. The farm changed gradually in the background of the records, but the people remained unmistakably the same couple whose photographs Reed had shown Grace during the investigation. Harold had not simply known about the missing child case. He had continued following the family long after leaving Iowa. Grace found notes connected to the photographs. Some contained dates. Others identified events that had occurred in the Carter family. There were references to annual newspaper notices in which Natalie marked Madeline's birthday and continued asking for information from anyone who might remember something from 1996. Nothing in the chest supported the story Grace had been told about her own childhood. There were no records of her supposed parents. No photographs of the mother Harold had described as his daughter. No documents proving the car accident that had supposedly left Grace orphaned. No family history explaining why Harold had become her guardian. Instead, there were records connected to another child. A child who had disappeared at 5 years old. A child who would now be exactly Grace's age. Deeper in the chest were documents related to Grace Bennett's identity. They included copies of the delayed birth registration issued near the end of 1996, materials connected to school enrollment in Idaho, and handwritten notes Harold had used when assembling the history that would follow Grace through childhood. The documents were not simply old paperwork. Taken together, they showed how an identity had been built after the summer of 1996 rather than documented from birth. The conclusion was becoming impossible to avoid. Grace Bennett had not been fully documented before Harold Bennett left Iowa. At the bottom of the chest was a sealed envelope addressed directly to her. The writing belonged to Harold. The message had been prepared for a time after his death. Inside was the explanation he had never been willing to give while alive. Harold began by admitting that Grace Bennett was not the name she had been born with. Her real name was Madeline Carter. He wrote that on August 12, 1996, he had been driving near the Carter farm when he saw Madeline close to the county road. He knew the family. He had been on the property before. The Carter dog recognized him because Harold had previously helped with ordinary farm work, including fence repairs. Nothing about his presence would have appeared dangerous to a 5-year-old child. Harold used that familiarity. He told Madeline about a newborn calf and gave her a reason to go with him. She trusted him. The decision had not been part of a long-term kidnapping plan. Harold admitted that his motive came from the resentment he had carried against Gregory Carter for years. The old property dispute had damaged the Bennett family financially. Harold believed his father had spent his final years consumed by the loss of land, legal costs, and humiliation. After his father died, that resentment did not disappear. Harold had watched Gregory continue operating a successful farm on land the Bennett family believed should have remained theirs. Over time, he began to think of Gregory's life as something unfairly protected from the kind of loss that had destroyed his own family. On August 12, that resentment became action. Harold's original intention was not to raise Madeline as his own. He intended to keep her away from the Carter family only long enough for Gregory to experience fear, uncertainty, and helplessness. Harold wanted him to understand what it meant to lose something that could not immediately be recovered. But the search escalated faster than Harold expected. Law enforcement arrived. Volunteers filled the area. The disappearance became a county-wide emergency. Harold understood that returning Madeline would expose him. The same familiarity that had allowed him to take her without resistance would make him an obvious suspect once she explained what had happened. At the same time, Harold already had a possible way out. Before Madeline disappeared, he had been considering selling his farm because of debt and declining income. The sale was not originally connected to the abduction. But once he believed he could no longer return Madeline without going to prison, the existing financial plan became an escape route. He accelerated the sale. He left Iowa. And Madeline left with him. Harold's confession explained that the decision to create a permanent new identity came later. During the period after leaving Washington County, he continued telling himself that the situation could somehow be corrected. But with every passing week, returning became more complicated. Eventually, he gave Madeline another name, Grace Bennett. He created the story that her parents had died and that he was her maternal grandfather. He used a delayed birth registration and later school records to build enough administrative history for the identity to survive ordinary scrutiny. What had begun as an act of revenge became a permanent life. Harold admitted that he understood the contradiction. He knew he had committed a crime against Madeline and against the Carter family. He also knew that, over time, he had become the person responsible for raising her. The longer the deception continued, the more he convinced himself that revealing the truth would cause another kind of damage. Returning Madeline after years under the name Grace would mean destroying the only identity she consciously remembered. Harold used that fear to justify continued silence. But his letter did not excuse the beginning. He acknowledged that none of the years that followed changed what happened on August 12, 1996. Madeline Carter had trusted a familiar neighbor. Harold Bennett had used that trust to take her away. And every part of Grace Bennett's life had been built afterward on the decision he made that day. Grace had spent most of her life believing that the name Grace Bennett connected every part of her history. After reading Harold's confession, that name no longer felt like an unquestioned fact. It had become something constructed after August 1996, supported by documents, repeated stories, and years of routine until it became indistinguishable from truth. But there was one part of the investigation that Harold's letter did not explain. The silver bracelet. Detective Mason Reed had come to Idaho because that bracelet had been mailed from Bonner County to Gregory and Natalie Carter in Iowa. The package contained no letter, no return address, and no explanation. For investigators, it had been the event that revived a case that had been nearly silent for 25 years. Grace now knew exactly who had sent it. She had. The memory had never truly disappeared. She had pushed it into a part of her mind she did not want to examine. Approximately 6 months before Harold's death, his health had deteriorated enough that Grace took greater responsibility for insurance paperwork, medical records, and documents connected to his treatment. During that process, she searched parts of the house that had rarely mattered before. That was when she first discovered the concealed compartment. She had found the cedar chest months before Detective Reed ever contacted her. At that time, Grace did not examine everything inside. She opened enough of it to understand that something was deeply wrong. She saw newspaper clippings about the disappearance of Madeline Carter. She saw photographs of Gregory and Natalie Carter. She saw records from Iowa. And among the objects Harold had preserved was a small silver identification bracelet. The inside was engraved with one name, Madeline. The bracelet created a reaction that none of the newspaper articles could produce. The name meant nothing to the life Grace consciously remembered, yet the object itself felt strangely familiar. She could not connect it to a specific event or image, but she knew that the bracelet did not feel like something belonging entirely to another child. That feeling frightened her more than the documents. For days, Grace tried to explain the chest in ways that would protect the life she already knew. Harold might have collected information about an old case because he had once lived near the Carter family. The photographs might have been connected to guilt over leaving Iowa during the investigation. The bracelet might have been acquired later. Each explanation required ignoring another detail. Eventually, Grace found the Carter family's address in the material Harold had saved. She did not contact Natalie. She did not call law enforcement. She did not write a confession because she had no confession to give. Grace still did not know what she believed. Instead, she placed the bracelet in a small package and mailed it to Iowa without including her name. It was the only action she could take without fully accepting what the bracelet might mean. Some part of her wanted the object returned to the people who had spent 25 years waiting for Madeline. Another part wanted to know what would happen if the bracelet reached them. If it truly belonged to the missing child, perhaps someone else would discover the truth without forcing Grace to say it first. Once the package was gone, fear replaced curiosity. The possibility that Harold had lied about her entire childhood became too large to confront. Grace returned to the hidden compartment, closed the chest, secured it again, and tried to resume the life she understood. Harold was dying. Whatever questions existed inside the house felt impossible to separate from the man who had raised her. That was why Detective Reed's arrival had affected her so deeply. When he described Madeline Carter, the delayed birth certificate, Harold's history in Iowa, and the missing bracelet, Grace had already seen enough evidence to know that his theory was not random. But accepting his conclusion would have required her to condemn Harold while he was still alive. It would also have required her to admit that the identity she had used for almost 25 years might have begun with a kidnapping. Denial became easier than dismantling everything at once. She defended Harold. She refused the DNA test. She insisted the investigators had made a mistake. Now Harold was dead, and his own written confession had removed the last explanation that could preserve the old story. Grace contacted Detective Mason Reed. For Reed, the call ended weeks of uncertainty. He had returned to Iowa believing the strongest lead in the case might disappear because Grace would never agree to genetic testing. Harold's death had eliminated the possibility of questioning the man who could provide direct answers. Grace's decision changed that immediately. Law enforcement in Idaho arranged a voluntary DNA collection. A standard buccal swab was taken and processed through the appropriate forensic channels. The sample was compared with the genetic profiles available from Gregory and Natalie Carter. There was no need for interpretation when the results returned. The biological relationship was confirmed. Grace Bennett was the daughter of Gregory and Natalie Carter. The woman living in Idaho was Madeline Carter. The result also confirmed that the administrative history created after 1996 had hidden a missing child in ordinary American life. A delayed birth registration, a story about deceased parents, a period of claimed homeschooling, and a grandfather acting as a guardian had been enough to allow Madeline to grow up under another name without attracting serious suspicion. For Reed, the DNA result resolved the central question that had followed the case since August 12, 1996. Madeline had not died in a field, a creek, or an unknown place beyond Washington County. She had survived. For Gregory and Natalie, the result ended 25 years without certainty. Every birthday Natalie had marked belonged to a daughter who was still alive somewhere during those same years. Every letter placed inside the wooden memory box had been written to a woman who existed, even though she had no idea anyone in Iowa was still waiting for her. For Grace, the result carried a different weight. DNA did not erase the years she had lived as Grace Bennett. It did not erase the schools she attended, the work she had done, or the memories she had formed with Harold. But it established something Harold's stories could no longer change. She had been born Madeline Carter. She had been 5 years old when she disappeared from Iowa. And after 25 years, the family who had never stopped searching finally knew that their daughter was alive. Madeline Carter's return to Iowa was handled with as much privacy as possible. There were no public events, no dramatic announcements, and no attempt to turn the moment into a celebration for people who had followed the case from a distance. After 25 years, the truth belonged first to the family that had lived without it. For Gregory and Natalie Carter, knowing that their daughter was alive did not erase the years when they had no idea whether she had survived the day she disappeared. For Madeline, learning her real name did not instantly transform Gregory and Natalie into the parents she remembered. That was the most difficult part of coming home. Biology had answered the legal question. Memory had not answered the emotional one. Madeline understood that Gregory and Natalie were her parents. The DNA confirmed it. Harold Bennett's confession confirmed it. The original missing person records confirmed it. But the people connected to her earliest years existed only in fragments inside her memory. She had spent almost her entire conscious life as Grace Bennett. That identity could not simply be removed because it had been created dishonestly. Grace had attended school in Idaho. Grace had learned to drive. Grace had formed friendships, worked, paid bills, and built an adult life. Grace had known Harold as the person who raised her. Madeline Carter was the child hidden underneath that life. Returning to Washington County, therefore, became less about recovering the past than understanding how two identities could belong to the same person. Natalie understood sooner than anyone that forcing closeness would only create another kind of loss. She had waited 25 years for her daughter. She was prepared to wait longer for trust. Among the possessions Natalie had preserved from 1996 was Madeline's gray stuffed rabbit. It had remained in the family's care for decades, protected with the same attention given to photographs, school papers, and the wooden memory box filled with annual letters. One ear still carried the thick black stitches Natalie had used to repair it when Madeline was 5. The toy did not produce an instant transformation. There was no complete return of childhood memory. Instead, small pieces began to emerge. Madeline recognized the texture before she understood why it mattered. The repaired ear carried something deeper than visual familiarity. The uneven stitching connected to a memory of Natalie repairing the toy after it had been damaged. Another fragment involved the family's old golden retriever near the porch. Another carried the sense of safety associated with a home she had not consciously remembered in decades. They were not full scenes. They were traces. But they belonged to her. For the first time, Madeline did not need documents to prove that a life existed before Harold Bennett. Her own memory had begun to confirm it. That realization also made the truth about Harold more painful rather than easier. Madeline could not redefine him as only a monster. He had committed an unforgivable crime. He had taken a 5-year-old child from her parents because of resentment over a land dispute. He had created a false identity, fabricated a family history, and allowed Gregory and Natalie to spend 25 years believing their daughter might be dead. Nothing about the years that followed could erase that. But Madeline also could not pretend that every moment of her life with Harold had been cruel or false. He had raised her. He had provided stability. He had supported her education. He had remained present through the ordinary years of childhood and adulthood. The affection she remembered had been real to her. That contradiction became one of the hardest truths in the entire case. A person could commit a terrible act and still become emotionally important to the person harmed by it. Madeline understood that loving parts of the life she had known did not mean forgiving the crime that created it. She also understood that condemning Harold's decision did not require her to erase every memory connected to him. Detective Mason Reed later completed a more detailed review of the materials recovered from Harold's home. The records confirmed that Harold had followed the Carter family for years after leaving Iowa. He had kept newspaper stories about Madeline's disappearance. He had saved anniversary coverage and public appeals connected to the case. He had also preserved photographs of Gregory and Natalie taken at different periods of their lives. The evidence showed that Harold never truly escaped what he had done. He remained connected to the family he had harmed even while continuing to hide Madeline from them. His private notes showed growing guilt over the years. He understood that returning Madeline would expose the crime and disrupt the identity he had built around her. He also understood that remaining silent meant Gregory and Natalie would never receive an answer. Harold chose silence. That choice continued the harm long after the original abduction. By the time he died in 2021, the secret had shaped 3 lives for a quarter century. Gregory and Natalie had lived with unresolved grief. Madeline had lived with a stolen identity. Harold had lived with the knowledge that the family he destroyed remained only a few records and photographs away from the truth. The silver bracelet became the object that finally ended that silence. It had left Iowa with Madeline in 1996. 25 years later, Madeline herself sent it back without fully understanding why she could not ignore it. The bracelet carried no confession, carried no explanation, contained only one engraved word: Madeline. That name was enough. It reopened the investigation, connected Idaho to Iowa, led Mason Reed back to Harold Bennett, and forced the hidden history of Grace Bennett into the open. For Natalie, the bracelet returned something she had never allowed herself to stop believing. For Madeline, it became the first decision she made in the direction of her own truth, even before she was ready to accept what that truth meant. The Carter family did not attempt to recreate the 25 years that had been taken from them. They could not. Natalie could not return to the day Madeline started school. Gregory could not teach his daughter to drive for the first time. Madeline could not recover birthdays, holidays, graduations, or ordinary family years that had belonged to another life. What they could do was stop measuring their relationship only by what had been stolen. They began with the present. Madeline learned who Gregory and Natalie had become. Gregory and Natalie learned to know their daughter as the adult she actually was rather than the 5-year-old they had preserved in memory. There was grief in that process, But there was also something the previous 25 years had never allowed them to have. Choice. Harold had made one decision in 1996 that took choices away from everyone around him. In 2021, Madeline began reclaiming them. She could decide which name to use. She could decide how quickly to rebuild a relationship with her biological parents. She could decide what memories of Harold she would keep and which truths about him she would refuse to excuse. She could decide what family meant after learning that blood, memory, love, betrayal, and history did not fit into simple categories. The story of Madeline Carter did not end because a missing child was found. It continued because an adult woman was finally given the right to understand her own life. The deepest loss had never been only the 25 years taken from her. It was the right to know who she was. And the most hopeful part of her return was not that the past could be repaired. It was that the future no longer had to be built on a lie. Some wounds do not disappear when the truth arrives. Some years cannot be returned, and some relationships cannot become what they might have been. But truth can still restore something time cannot. Can return choice. Can return dignity. And sometimes, after everything else has been taken away, that is where coming home truly begins. Thank you sincerely for taking the time to listen to today's story. We truly appreciate every moment you spend with us and every emotion you share along the way. Stories like this remind us that life can sometimes be shaped by choices made in a single moment, and that the consequences of those choices can remain for many years. Madeline's journey teaches us that truth may be delayed, hidden, or difficult to accept, but it still has the power to restore dignity, identity, and hope. We cannot always recover the years that have been lost, and we cannot undo every painful decision from the past. What we can do is choose how we move forward. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting what happened, and healing does not mean pretending the pain never existed. Sometimes healing simply means finding the courage to face the truth and allowing ourselves the chance to begin again. This story also reminds us to value the people we love while we still have time with them. Family is not only about shared blood, but also about honesty, trust, responsibility, and the choices we make for one another. If today's story touched your heart or gave you something to think about, supporting our channel is very simple. Please give this video a like, share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel so you can continue joining us for more meaningful stories. Thank you again for listening, for caring, and for being part of this community.